would you please check your ideas and opinions at the door? All your philosophical and religious views, all your logic, because I say check it at the door advisedly because you can pick it up again when you go out if you feel unsafe without it. I'm not trying to argue you out of your opinions and views. I'm merely suggesting that for the sake of an experiment, you temporarily suspend it.
You might have to, so just a caveat, you may have to just slow me down for for the sake of clarity. I may go off into several different directions. People, I promise I'll circle back around. You may have to help me remember what I began speaking about. This is one of the subjects I am most passionate about and most involved in. And it spans a lot of ground. I mean, you need to have like a semi-scholarly understanding to really be able to begin to parse esoteric Christianity.
Yes. Well, I couldn't have picked a better person to do it with. On that note, tonight.
Well, that's debatable.
Yeah. Well, as far as at least my general contacts go and my perception so far. So this evening I'm here with the one and only Ike Baker, Golden Dawn Temple Chief, practicing Martinist and host of the Arcanvm podcast, where he dedicates his efforts to the study of occult philosophy, magic, and the history of the esoteric Western tradition. In addition to that, Ike is also a carpenter by trade. I see what you're doing there, Ike. You're replicating the whole Jesus model with the carpentry trade thing. So very clever and fitting for this conversation.
No. No, none of that.
No. But seriously, yeah, thank you for being back. Believe it or not, we're already on our third round of podcasts. So yeah, pretty awesome.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me. I love, you're one of my favorite people just to talk to in general. I wish we did it more, but this is great. This is great too. And I know it's not really 100% your bag, but I will always, there's an open door anytime you want to come be on my podcast as well.
Yeah, we're going to have to do that. We're going to do this eventually. And, okay, cool. So, Ike and I were going to be diving into the subject of esoteric Christianity. So I kind of looked at, the Wikipedia tidbit on the general definition of esoteric Christianity, and here's how it goes. Esoteric Christianity is an approach to Christianity which features secret traditions that require an initiation to learn or understand. So there's that. And so esoteric or esotericos is a little different than occults or hidden. There may be crossover, but there's the word occult as opposed to revealed, I guess, and then or the unseen as the plurality of the seen. And then when it comes to the esoteric, or the Greek esoterikos, this is more so indicative of inner, eso being relation to inner as exoteric, or exo as indicative of outer. And I'll just kind of briefly reference Richard Smuley of the Theosophical Society. Looked over an article that he had written a while back where he talked about term being, first used in antiquity to refer to the writings of philosophers that were meant for their students rather than the public at large, the inner group as opposed to the outer masses. And so, yeah, there's a whole lot more to his article, but that was just a little tidbit that I gleaned. But Of course, this can be applied as well to the individual, the inner self, and the inner learning as well. And I think the Bible, or the Bibles, or the books that comprise the common Christian canons, as we currently know them, they're a lot more spiritual than they are historical. And with that being said, I don't claim to know that. I definitely can't say with certainty that there are no historical truths encapsulated in the biblical scriptures. I feel like that would be pretty extreme on my part. There could very well be, many verifiable and historically accurate depictions in regards to the actual people, places, locations, etc. And who am I to pretend to know the actual validity or accuracy of any proposed history that I've not personally experienced? But nor do I feel that the intention of the transmission and dissemination of these texts is to derive their value from historical accuracy alone. And I think it's important to draw attention to, as Jordan Peterson points out in regards to truth, there are higher levels of truth. And a spiritual or a philosophical truth is basically at the pinnacle of that hierarchy. I would say operative in the archetypal world that transcends materiality. And so in regards to these things as histories alone, I feel it doesn't really bring one into gnosis or any true religious experience, any true religare, to use the Latin, any true coming back to or rebinding or reunification with the all, essentially. So this brings into question the Christian religion, the Christian reunification with source, as it something that is primordial religious pursuit, perhaps predating the figure of Yeshua. I want to get your thoughts on that. Do you feel like this whole biblical interpretation, depiction, dissemination, transmission, Yeshua, Jesus, in regards to the Christ, is this whole sort of religion in its true sense, is this something that predates the actual figure, real or not, or the writings of Jesus? Is this something that predates Jesus? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I want to be very measured here. It's funny. I'm not going to say I had an argument. I didn't.
Yes.
But there was something posted on the internet as is usually the beginning of one of these stories, and it was more of that kind of syncretic, very postmodern, almost like DMT culture type of well, the Bible goes back. I mean, they were pulling from Egyptian things and stuff like that. And it's like, that's a postmodern kind of reinterpretation or simplistic, way overly simplistic rereading, really, of what is going on here. You've effectively stripped it of all nuance of time and place. And we do that because of this. Our modern era is one of supreme hubris, and which is it's taught, that is talked about. It's not just exclusive to our day. I mean, it's talked about at length in many of the gospels, not just the canonical ones, this idea of hubris. And so my response to that was basically like, look, just because certain things share similarities does not necessarily mean they are derivative from them in a way where I think the person had said, like, passages from the book of the Egyptian Book of the Dead were lifted. Okay, first of all, I've read that, and I've read the New Testament in the original Greek almost fully, not completely. Nothing was ever lifted whole cloth. There are certain archetypes of experience, both material and spiritual, that we cannot avoid discussing. to say that one was just an older version of the other is kind of like saying, well, Cujo is an older version of Clifford the Big Red Dog because they share a core similarity. We are very much confined to being able to use specific mythic symbola or narratives in order to explain these things, because at the end of the day, it's like Bruce Lee said, it's just a finger pointing at the moon. If you pay only attention to the finger, you'll miss out on all that heavenly glory, as he says. Very much applicable to this situation. I do think that so if you even read the canonical gospels, right? Let's just take Matthew, for instance. Jesus of the canonical gospel of Matthew would probably agree with you. He'd probably say something to the effect, very cryptically, of course, because they were predicting me. I hadn't come into the world yet, but all that stuff was my underlying presence that human beings were only glimpsing at, guessing at. It was a hint. It was a forerunning of me. And I do believe that to be the truth in a certain way, but I don't consider it plagiarism in the way that I see it in the modern context as an attempt to invalidate and refute Christian doctrine or ideas and say this is plagiarism. And I know that you didn't, that's not what you're implying by asking the question, but I think for whoever's listening to this, it's of supreme importance that I say this. And so, it's kind of like amateur scholarship. You're just wiping away all the other stuff that comes into play. I mean, the thing that was interesting about all the texts surrounding the Christ event is that they transmit this very unique cosmology and soteriology, which, I mean, literally translated, that means like saviorology, the study of salvation, the study of the Savior. But it's transmitted very uniquely, particularly if you are familiar with the milieu in which early Christianities started, right? Because there was never one. Katholikos in Greek means universal, and there was never one universal Christianity. It didn't exist. There were certain church fathers who tried to claim it, but the historical evidence is that, they believed, let's say, I mean, they had differences on everything you could have a difference on. The nature of Christ's message, what exactly purpose it meant to convey, what Christ actually was. Was he fully man? Was he also fully God? Was he a messenger? Was he some sort of spiritual potency come to fruition, to incarnation? And they had very, very different opinions. So you have to understand, that's why we have to cover a lot of ground, because, I mean, that early Christianity stems, their entire worldview was basically Hellenized Judaism, which contains core elements of Neoplatonism with Christ. You just add Christ to that, and Christ becomes this resolution to the problem of existence in the material universe under the governance of what they called the archons, archontes, these things, the governors, the rulers. And it's really interesting because a lot of what you said in your intro was basically what I had been thinking about on the first podcast. You had this way of surprising me with some of your questions, and it was great because it really stretched me in the moment. And then even afterwards, I had to really think about, and those are my favorite experiences, when I have to not explain to anyone else, but explain to myself, really. why or what I believe. And I would say that esoteric Christianity from this standpoint now is taking the literature and doctrines surrounding the Christ event and reading that in an, as you say, right, esoteric context, in the same way that Jewish Kabbalists read the Torah or the Tanakh. As the only difference is that one is sanctioned, right? The rabbinical authorities sanction Kabbalah. They even encourage it. Whereas on the other hand, Christianity, the authorities, they discourage it. It's an anathema. It's blasphemy to a certain degree. Exactly what you're saying, reading it on multiple levels. There is the letter, there is this the spirit and the soul. You know, there is that was the style of writing at the time. You know, the first, second centuries AD or CE. You know, everything was pseudoepigrapha, you know, written by a philosopher or a disciple or a devotee and attributed to somebody else. You know, Hermes Trismegistus and, you know, some Egyptian priest, Abaddon and things like that. But there was a lot of word play. You know, there was a lot of symbolism because, right, I mean, there really is no other way to really talk about this stuff. It defies meaning. That, I mean, it defies definition. You know, that is why we seek gnosis. You know, to have an insight that is beyond the word. But we have to use these mythic narratives, these symbolic stories, in order to communicate these on some levels. And that was the exoteric. The exoteric stuff were the parables, when Christ would go out and speak to, you know, the quote unquote masses, and then he would, and even some of his disciples did not understand him. You know, there were certain disciples that he didn't give the whole teaching to, and we see. So that's kind of where the question. So where does the idea of esoteric Christianity come from? Why is there one school of thought that has now been, all these different branches of Christian thought have now been kind of pigeonholed into esoteric Christianity? And then on the other hand, there's large and small o orthodoxy. Really, we have clues, right? I believe it's in the Gospels of both Luke and Matthew, when Christ basically says, he's asked why he speaks in parables, and he says, for some, it is given to know, you know, the truth or the teaching of God, and for others, it is not given to know. So right there, he's establishing this idea that, yes, I do speak in parables, and parables convey only a part of the truth, and the other stuff I can only communicate to those who are given to know it. Okay, so there's that. And then there's also in the non-canonical gospels, such as like the Gospel of Thomas, where Thomas answers a question kind of correctly. It's almost like a Zen koan type of thing that Christ gives to him, and he takes him into a side room and reveals certain truths to him. And when he comes out, the other disciples or his friends, they ask him, "What did the master say to you?" And he's like, "If I told you, you would stone me to death, and those stones would turn to fire and consume you." So this is a potent distinction between, as you say, inner door Christianity and outer door Christianity, and what goes into the exploration of one versus the other is dogma on the outer door, right? And then studying the dogma of the church and the letter of the quote unquote law, and the discoveries or workings out of the church fathers. And then on the other hand, in esoteric Christianity, we have a much bigger sandbox to play in, because we have all these other gospels that were written, you know, about the same time. I don't know if anybody back then, how, you know, you had to care a lot about something in order to write it down.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm so glad I decided to do this episode with you because this is already going to be great. And there's so many directions that we can go off in. But I guess I'll try to keep it along the lines of what you're going with. So a couple names that may be associated with esoteric Christianity in older times, perhaps. I want to see what your thoughts are on this, but Clement of Alexandria and maybe Origen, who led something called the Catechetical School of Alexandria. These participants in his school were known as the Didascalium and influential in early Christian controversies. So from my understanding, this was one of the two major centers or schools of biblical exegesis, the other being the school of Antioch. For people that may not be familiar with the word exegesis, it's Greek and it basically means to lead out or as a critical explanation or interpretation of a text, in particular biblical works. So anyway, I read that according to Jerome, at least, the Alexandrian school was founded by John Mark the Apostle, or Mark the Saint, as we know from the person ascribed to be the author of the biblical Gospel of Mark. But when I read that sentence and how it said John Mark the Apostle, I thought this is very interesting because I've had a few conversations recently along these kind of similar lines, and sort of illustrates this old use of the name John as a saintly title, not necessarily a name, just a name like we would normally think. So I think that that point has been coming up a lot with some of my guests when we're talking about things like Gnosticism and so on, with like Johannite Gnosticism or these traditions of John. So yeah, but anyway, in regards to the Catechetical School of Antioch, well, the Christian intellectuals of the Alexandria emphasized the allegorical interpretation of scriptures and tended towards a Christology that emphasizes the union of the human and the divine. Those in Antioch held to a more literal and occasionally typological exegesis of Christology that emphasized the distinction between the human and the divine in the person of Jesus Christ, as at least this was some stuff that I was reading. What are your thoughts on all that? Does that kind of strike anything in your mind that you find interesting?
Well, there's a lot to go off of in just what you just said. Addressing it in turn, I guess, if I can recall. So Clement of Alexandria, right? He actually famously said in some of his letters also, but also some of his writings, that it is necessary to speak in parables to some. He had this whole thing about the truth where it's like, you can't convey the truth to somebody who is not ready to receive it. And in this way is Christianity an initiation, right? You begin, and then there are sort of gradations. And okay, so how do you know when you're ready for the next thing? Well, you can contain more. Your spiritual insight has sort of unfolded. And that was very much, I think, his take in terms of this kind of what we were just talking about, the necessity of speaking in parables, and this idea of there being a secret or inner door or esoteric Christian teaching. I think that also it's really, really important to understand that Alexandria was a Hellenized, it was the center of the world at the time. It was, the epicenter of culture, learning, education, scholarship, religion, everything. And one of the consequences of Alexander the Great's, conquest of the known world at that time was the Hellenistic syncretism, which was a union of Greek and Egyptian cultures, ideas, philosophies, religious belief and practice, all coming together to form one solid tapestry. Now, what is important about that is that the Neoplatonic school flourished in Alexandria. For instance, Porphyry was Egyptian. Iamblichus was Egyptian. Many of these philosophers lived, worked, at least for a time, in Alexandria. Okay, and so what is Neoplatonism, right? Everybody's talking about it. It's everywhere. It's on every YouTube channel. But really, we have no other way to discuss it. We don't know what else to call it, because for 1,000 years, 1,500 years, the philosophy which Plato laid down was the way people looked at the world. It just was. That was the law in terms of philosophy. I'll put it this way: it was the philosophical water in which they all, or the air that they breathed. They weren't even aware of it enough as a segmented piece or tradition to be able to call themselves Neoplatonists. In fact, they didn't. What's really interesting about that is that the Gnostic schools that were occurring at the same time, right? Gnosis being knowledge, spiritual insight. Some people interpret that as an experiential knowledge. Like, for instance, lots of people have seen you on your podcast, but until they meet you in person and shake your hand, they have no gnosis of you. So there's, they have a knowledge of you until then. So there's also that interpretation. The Gnostic schools of early Christianity derived essentially their entire worldview from this kind of Hellenized Judaism that stemmed from the late Platonist philosophers, which we call Neoplatonists. And so essentially what you end up having is, it's not just Christology. It's not just that. It's not just the study of Christ. It's also this underlying stuff that's super, super important that most philosophers in particular would have taken for granted at the time as their worldview. And there are a couple of things that are coming to prominence now. Words like the ogdoad, words like demiurge, words like eons and the spheres of causality. These are all Platonic. These were written about in the dialogues of Plato 2,500 years ago. Okay, so they carried forward all that stuff as their prevailing worldview until the time of the Alexandrian school, during that time. And then is when the Christ event was purported to happen. And we can go into that a little bit more, into the particulars of the Gnostic, conception of the cosmology and where Christ fits in. What is the necessity? What is the mission of Christ within this? That is very important to esoteric Christianity. Very, very important. It's not something we should sort of, fly past. But in broad strokes, you basically had all of that informed by Neoplatonism. And what you see really, right, you could read it a couple of different ways. You could read it as Christ was this kind of reverse engineered idea or retrofitted onto this pre-existing idea of, let's say, Mithraism, or this idea of Sol Invictus, the savior, really, the hero, the man god, right? You could say that. Or you could also say that since all these things were happening around the same time, it's almost as if that spirit entered into human affairs, that little window. And what essentially that spirit is the freeing of that which is immortal in us from subjection to fate, which as conceptualized at that time it was basically we were subjects of the archons, or really, to a certain degree, the gods, right? and the gods in a lot of cases were believed to be, at least a part of their kind of existence was the physical part of their existence was literally believed to be the planets, the wandering stars. And so these gods required worship and tribute. And really, it was like sucking up to your boss. You either had to get on their good side or make an ally, of some other thing. And there was this cultus of worship and tribute and placating. And essentially, a spirit of transcendence from that, which was already present in, let's say, the theurgy of Iamblichus, who attempted to use the gods to transcend those spheres of causality. To what, degree or not he was successful, only he will know, and his God. But at the end of the day, you have around this time period this idea, this spirit coming into the affairs or the awareness of human beings, that this is the next step. This is the new dispensation. This is where we have to go to transcend materiality. We must step from the sides to the center, become as the sun, and, rise to the glory of a new day in the apparent death and darkness that is materiality, not subject to the causal spheres. And I think that hint, that intimation was swimming around in that time and in that place. And that is specifically why it's so important to meet those works on their own terms, instead of trying to pigeonhole them and classify them as some kind of syncretism that's, just hijacking older things. It's like, let's be real, we're able to look at history at these broad swaths of time, like this much, and think about how all the minutia and the details of our personal lives and the politics of state and of town and of things like that, how intricate and troublesome and strange they are, and then to deny that because it's much more comfortable for us to say, I have it figured out now.
Yes. Wow. Ah, man, so many things. Okay. When you were speaking about the archons or the gods, it's kind of a similar subject that I touched on with the alchemist Brian Cotton. When I had interviewed him, we were discussing how so many people get hung up when you say the gods. This is not necessarily to be conflated with the level of the one God, is it? I want to kind of flesh that out and get your response on that, because I've had these conversations before where I'd be talking to some individuals and they would kind of just get lost at that point. You say the gods and they think you're competing with the God or the one God, and they think that you're talking something on the level of God as the one or such. So yeah, maybe just respond to that point real quick.
Sure. So the thing about that whole idea is that we go back to Platonism and Neoplatonism. So within the works of Plato himself, there is no beating around the bush about it. If you go back and read what was said and the context and everything, it's very, very deliberate in intimating a monist theology, or something that I like to call ultimate monotheism, which means that, there are gods that are, in some way pendant or emanated as a product of this absolute, which is unknowable. We cannot talk about it. we can only, right? That's pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite, another Neoplatonist early Christian church father, established this thing called, apophasis, the apophatic tradition, meaning we can only describe the absolute, which is God, right? When in the Platonic sense of the word, to en, the one. That comes later, actually. That's in the philosophy of Plotinus. Plato conceptualized it more as to agatho, the good. But essentially, you have this idea of this absolute realm that can only be spoken of in negations. It is not that. It is not this. It's not that thing, because it has no way. It's incommunicable. It's ineffable. It defies all description, as it should, and we can't really think on those terms. Which is why something like gnosis is such a potent spiritual transformative event, because we are seriously limited in the things that we can communicate by speech and by the written word. But specifically in once we hit Plotinus, right, the quote unquote father of Neoplatonism, we descend into or evolve into this idea of emanative theology, where this is where all things are kind of emanating from the one, from the absolute. And it's really interesting. Porphyry kind of talks about it in terms of the concentric spheres that Plato wrote of. And we see the same thing in like Lurianic Kabbalah, the same thing, the same emanative theology of concentric spheres, of which, a portion of these are attributed to planetary correspondences. So essentially, what is being said is that, yes, everything is a product of sort of this mitosis, I guess, this kind of transcendental splitting of the self, or pouring out of the self of the absolute. So, the problem that you come across is that, people give names to quote unquote God. In the Hebrew Bible, it's, or the Torah and Tanakh, you have different names for it. El, Shaddai, El Chai, Adonai, all that kind of stuff. Yahweh. But it's not, there is an unutterable title, an ineffable sort of name or quality towards the transcendent, God. And I think that in most pantheons, I mean, even if you go in to ancient India in the Far East, I mean, they have Brahma, which is the Godhead. That also is this kind of idea of the central point from which everything spills forth. So what we're really talking about is this idea that, and I think I've used this analogy before, like God, capital G God, I think according to most people, is the white prism of light. If you've ever seen the Pink Floyd album cover, The Dark Side of the Moon, it hits the triangular or the tetrahedronal prism and splits. It splinters into the 7, right? How many? 7 primary colors. Okay, those are the gods.
Absolutely. And okay, what a great response. Yeah, I think like if we were to actually name God, and I mean in truth, that we would have to, we'd have to use ourselves and humanity and the earth and the planets and the solar system and the galaxies and the universe in order to even describe, essentially, because in my opinion, God is all. So it's like, it would be something along those lines. But yeah, I kind of wanted to bounce back to a couple things that you were saying earlier. One was, I wanted to comment on, that was interesting how you mentioned Porphyry and Iamblichus were Egyptian. That's something I had guessed I'd never really made that connection.
Sorry, I made a mistake.
No worries.
Actually, Porphyry was I think Phoenician. Obviously,
Oh,
he traveled to Egypt. I'm pretty sure he did his work in Alexandria because he studied under Plotinus, who was Egyptian.
mm,
So it's Plotinus and Iamblichus that were Egyptian born.
mm,
But again, they were Hellenistic, right? So it's this Greco-Egyptian synthesis. That's why, you know, it's all their writings were in Greek. It was the lingua franca, and they were using Greek philosophy. And not only that, but all the books of the New Testament were written in Koine Greek, which, you know, the language that was being used at the time. It's very, very hyper specific to that place in that time.
definitely. And then you were talking about like some of these words that are kind of coming back into the zeitgeist, I guess. One of them being the ogdoad. Can you maybe lend a little bit of insight into what that refers to?
Sure. So again, this is really, really important, what I'm about to kind of delineate in terms of Gnostic cosmology and things like that, and the whole plan of why Christ came and what Christ was or is. So you basically have right, we're going to go back to this a lot. Between me and Jamie, we're just going to keep going back to this. But at the end of Plato's Republic, at the end of the 10th book of Plato's Republic, there is a very short but powerful relation of a near-death experience that occurred in ancient times, right? And purportedly happened to this soldier named Now, what witnesses while out of the body is essentially the wheelwork or the karmic mechanism of all creation. And essentially, he sees from his vantage point what is conceptualized to be a spindle, right? Like you're spinning cloth. So what the spindle does is it takes separate sort of strands of cloth and it spins them and weaves them together into a unified whole. Okay, and that is the mythic narrative, the symbolic image that Plato gives us to represent karma, right? Because it's the soul is now dead and it has passed out of what they believe to be the realm of causality, right? The spheres beyond the planets, the spheres beyond the ogdoad, which I'll get to in a minute, I promise. But and he essentially sees from this exterior vantage point how the universe is held together, and it's essentially 8 spheres. And you can picture it like nested bowls if you want to, right? So the outermost sphere is the ogdoad. Ogdoas means 8th. That's all it means in Greek. It means the 8th. And that is when ancient peoples from their georeferential standpoint on Earth looked up at the night sky, they saw a dome, right? The dome of the heavens, the dome of the firmament. And they saw embedded in groups, in clusters, that always remained consistent to each other, these star constellations. And they moved kind of like this as the dome moved. But then there were these other stars, very, very bright, very, very big. And they kind of did this weird thing where they didn't move with the rest of the constellations and the rest of the domes. And these were the planets, right? Planetes, the wanderers. So now, looking from his exterior position, he saw that these were all shells within shells within shells. And he delineates essentially how he descended from outside the sphere of causality, outside the sphere of karma, through, or really came out from it, but descended down through that 8th sphere, that outer shell that encased everything. That's the ogdoad. And then through each successive planetary sphere. Now, Porphyry developed this later on. Because in Plato's myth of before that descent takes place and before the soul is weaved, they're literally put into the spindle and wrapped around their daimon, their guiding spirit, before they're sent into this spindle of karma that extends through the entire visible universe. Before that happens, they drink of the river Lethe, meaning forgetfulness. Okay. And each soul essentially enters the causal sphere as tabula rasa, blank slate. Now, on the descent from beyond the ogdoad through it, at each planetary sphere, it is invested with what Porphyry called an astral garment. And that is essentially the positive and negative qualities associated with this planetary sphere are imprinted into that soul, that blank soul. However they're related to each other, by aspect, by degree, whatever it was, however those planets are aligned, they are imprinted into you. And this belief carries all the way over to Gnostic Christian thought because it came from Hellenized Judaism during the time of Neoplatonism.
Ooh, absolutely. And I had a couple conversations with a few different people about different traditions revolving around bringing souls into the world at particular times and the sort of mystery traditions around that. And that was all super fascinating because there's, certain astrological elections that would be more conducive to particular soul archetypes that would be maybe more beneficial for the times and whatever time individuals were living in at those times that they would want to bring into existence. And the idea was that they were operating with the goal of bringing those souls into existence at those particular astrological alignments so that they would, like you're saying, fall through those spheres to embody those particular archetypes to then be that person on the planet to help be of service in such a great way, as opposed to just randomly willy-nilly having a soul become incarnate or something along those lines. So that was interesting. I think that corresponds to what you're saying.
Yeah, that is super interesting. Actually, I've been doing a lot of work with that myself, not in creating a person just yet, but I've been exploring things like that in terms of like writing. I've written rituals specifically about that from the point of view, from that exterior point of view beyond the spheres of causality, and kind of ritualized what that would look like. And in Greek, that's called during that Hellenistic period, they call that the kairos, which is auspicious timing. This is the kairos. This is the right moment.
Yeah, kairos as opposed to chronos, I believe.
Right.
Which is more along the lines of like divine timing, right?
Well, chronos is just time in general. I'm not to get too deep, but Chronos and kinesis were the two things with which the grand geometer built the material universe. That is time and movement, which are very, very important concepts. But Kairos is the right time. Kairos is more of a moment. If you wanted to say like, what time is it? You wouldn't say Kairos, and you probably wouldn't say Chronos. You would say ora, ti ora ine. What hour is it? But I mean, that's modern Greek. So
yeah, not my wheelhouse, but that's fascinating. My other note on here is that you were bringing up the point about, the original terminology of Catholic, or where the term Catholic derives from, as being basically universal. And I think that's such a good point because, and I think that this point is also made by Eliphas Levi. I think he brings it up in his book, The Paradoxes of Science, if I'm not mistaken. But that's a good point. And the original, Catholicism, it's all about universality, and maybe over time that got distorted and switched up a bit. So I just want to make that comment, put that out there. And then I wanted to make a note on in regards to your comment on sort of how people are relating some of these Egyptian writings or tablets or whatever in regards to biblical stories, and maybe I think it's more so with the Old Testament in regards to these correlations, and I myself have brought similar things up. For example, like the instructions of Amenenope from the Egyptian, and I guess this is kind of in regards, I think it was in regards to the Proverbs of Solomon. I think it's just so hard from a layman kind of relying on interpretations of these things. I mean, the common person maybe doesn't read or translate Egyptian or Greek or anything. We get these translations or these pieces of information, and we go about it in the best way we can to try to make sense of it all. And I think for me, at least, I look at it as, I don't necessarily care whether the Egyptian came first or the Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek came first or whatever. It's more about, I think it even validates the archetypal importance of the meaning behind it, if there are multiple and more sources restating and reiterating the same thing over time, because it's showing whatever that story is or whatever that message is of super significant importance. Yeah, I don't know. Just wanted to put that out there and kind of get your feedback on any of that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, it's I think it's not what I find in a lot of those when they're arguments instead of what you're saying, which is kind of this holism that acknowledges this idea of essentially what is called a perennial philosophy, right? And that goes as far back as Athanasius Kircher and Pico della Mirandola, that said, specifically in Athanasius Kircher, he said, look, the Hebrews spent so much time with the Egyptians, right? We know that, everybody knows that there was some cross-pollination that makes this significant, and he went through certain diagrams and studies in his Oedipus Egypticus and things like that. I think what he had said is either the Egyptians are Hebraizing or the Hebrews are Egypticizing. I can't tell. That was essentially his take home from it. And then you had somebody like Pico della Mirandola studying all those, spending all that time as an understudy and close friend to Marsilio Ficino. He looking at the Kabbalah and saying, this is it. This is the diagram of the perennial philosophy. This is the diagram that it encompasses all the Hebrew, beliefs. It encompasses all the Egyptian gods. But it is the capstone of it is the Christ consciousness, Tiferet in the center. He looked at it as a means of, like, they predicted the coming of Christ, and I think that there's validity to that. Again, I don't draw a hard line between whether or not it was an historical event or purely symbolic. I don't think that matters to me. I'm not saying one way or the other that I do or I don't. I don't need to. I'm not one of those people who needs to know whether it was this thing or that thing, because I have chased my tail for decades trying to base my own orientation of reality on historicity, which is like, we can only know this much, and again, that comes directly from Plato in the Timaeus, but I think that there is validity in all the traditions. I just happen to gravitate more towards some because they are more rich, more fruitful in spiritual pursuit, and two of those being the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which a lot of people, not enough people usually get through to realize that it's a Rosicrucian order, and that once you become an inner order member, you are now studying the mysteries of the cross. And then you have Martinism, which is explicitly Christian and contains an inner component of operative Christianity. So those are the two paths that bear most fruit to me, and they incorporate that kind of syncretism. They work with the Egyptian stuff, they work with the Hebrew stuff, but I think when it is presented as an argument for cultural possession, no, we had it first. No, we had it first. I mean, you're so far off the message. You're so far off the mark that I tend not to even want to have that conversation. Not for me, but for you. There's nothing I'm going to tell you that's going to you're stuck. You're stuck.
I agree 100%. Yeah. I really love that term and that notion of operative Christianity. That's awesome. Well, so let's talk Jesus or Yeshua. I guess I think of the figure of Jesus, historical or not, he embodies the sort of spirit of ascension or the aspiration towards perfection or the most exalted form of oneself. At the very least, symbolically or allegorically, the conception of the embodiment of the sort of universal spirit of or Christ force and the practice of, I would say, true Christian religiosity. It's not exclusive to the figure of Jesus. It's by its very nature universal. I think of it as like an alchemical spiritual process of maybe soul purification and a refinement or attunement. What would you say about the figure Jesus or Yeshua and what it all represents and what we should take away from it?
So this is a big question, and I'm glad you asked it, because like half of the things I've been thinking about for the past week, preparing for this conversation, are right here. This is the core of the message. This is the heart of the message, which is great. So a lot of people basically said, okay, if Christ was, they've said to me, if Christ was the fulfillment of this kind of theurgical model and it was still being operated by people like Iamblichus, there was a quote unquote spiritual science of ascent, leaving this place, this dense material place, from our perspective, right? Maybe not in a spatial location, but from our perspective, we are in the center of this big concentric sort of cage. The soul is, if Iamblichus and other Neoplatonic theurgists were working this, well, then why would we choose Christianity over theurgy? And to which I say, because the message, what Christ was the heart. Christ came to say, like, you don't do this with your head. You do this with your heart. That was one of the most interesting things that Christ, or the Christian message, the law, quote unquote, or the revision of the law, or the unveiling of the greater law that the Christ consciousness delivered to human beings, was the message of the heart, right? They call him the Sacred Heart. There are pictures of Christ, there are like icons of him pointing here. I mean, what do you think that means? That's essentially it. I mean, he was asked, what are the two greatest commandments? Love is the greatest commandment. Love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Before that, there was a lot of tribalism. Yes, of course, love your friends, love your family, love your tutelary deity, love, your benefactor. But not a lot of people were walking around saying, love your neighbor, love your enemy. And don't get me wrong, I'm not here to sanitize Christ, because there was a lot of claw and tooth to that message too. In another passage, he says, I come to bring, war and and a sword, in reference to doing battle with everything that was averse, adversarial to the unfoldment of that love. The most interesting thing about Christ, and in a similar way, we see another precursor in the Socratic dialogue. Socrates was very much like this. Everything he says flies in the face of common knowledge. Nobody at his time would have considered it wisdom. What do you mean? Turn the other, offer the man who smacked me, offer him my other cheek. What do you mean? Blessed are the poor. What does any of that mean? It sounds insane. And essentially, from an esoteric or Gnostic perspective, it makes sense that he's trying to tell you, you are trapped in the spheres of causality. The way out is opting out of the game. Conventional wisdom, I heard it said really great in a movie one time, what's good for man isn't good for God. And it's this kind of, right, he gave away his family. He gave away his possessions, gave away a home, and then said, if you do not leave your family and do as I do and take up your cross, you're not worthy of me, and essentially it's a formula for transcendence. And you see a lot of crossover in the things that the Gautama Buddha had to say. Life is suffering, and suffering is caused by desire, and relinquish, sever every tie that links you to desire. And Christ said the same thing. If I'll paraphrase, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It's kind of the same, a similar message. But a lot of the stuff that people bristle with, or at least they use to justify this kind of wholesale rejection of Christianity, actually doesn't even come from the New Testament. All the thou shalt not lay with another man the way thou would lay with a woman and things like that, that's from the Jewish law. It's from the Torah. It's not, Christ never said any of that. It's not in the New Testament. It's in the Old Testament. And what's very interesting is that there is a passage, I believe it's in the Gospel of Matthew, that says, essentially, I'm not telling you to ignore the prophets. I did not come to break, but to fulfill the law. So that makes you scratch your head. And a lot of people think, and I think it was in Matthew, because Matthew is the canonical gospel that tries to, it sort of links Christ as this figure, like we were talking about earlier, that all of the Hebrew prophets and the Hebrew law were prophesying. This is him. This is how, and this is how he's fulfilled every one of these things. Matthew kind of goes through that. Now, you have this line that I came not to break, but to fulfill the law. And so it gets a little dicey here in the translation. Fulfill as in what? Fulfill an obligation, fulfill these tasks. In reality, the Greek word, I think, is plerosai. All right, coming from the plero, meaning wholeness, fullness, completeness. So he's not saying that I came, to fulfill what was written about me, so much as he is saying at that point, like, the law you have is incomplete, and I come to complete it. It's kind of similar to the Buddha, that famous story when he was born. I don't know if it was the Maitreya Buddha or Gautama Buddha, but he took like a certain number of steps upon being born, and everywhere he stepped, a lotus flower bloomed, and his first words were, "I am come to turn the wheel of the law." Well, it's kind of the same thing with Christ here. He's giving you the higher revelation, the higher mysteries, the newest dispensation, and that really makes Christ the highest possible mystery. It's the greatest, deepest, most profound of the esoteric traditions. And one of the ways that we can sort of verify what he was saying is like, okay, a lot of times in the Gospels, Christ says, he starts what he says off like this. He says, "You have heard it said X, Y, and Z, but I say," and then he says something that completely contradicts that. And essentially what he's doing is he's quoting Jewish scripture. he's quoting law, he's quoting the Torah, and then he's saying, okay, that's not right. Here's how it really is. So he was, you know, in his own estimation, coming to complete the law. What we had was incomplete because it did not come from the highest God. It came from the demiurge. This is what is purported to be, you know, an esoteric interpretation of Christianity. And, you know, there's a lot there to unpack, and people will agree or disagree. I'm just, you know, relaying information. But then you also have things in the Hermetic Order, the Golden Dawn. You have things in, you know, Martina de Pasquale's Elu Cohen that also kind of corroborate these things and agree with them, you know, and understanding Christ as this is the way out. This is the way out. That's when nobody comes to the Father but through me. Not you have to believe, you know, in my physical existence, but I am showing you the way, how to get out of here, how to get out to completely transcend materiality so that you don't have to keep coming back. That was, again, a Neoplatonic and very Platonic idea. People say there's no ancient tradition of reincarnation, and it's total baloney. It was called metempsychosis, and that just means to change souls. But it's in the myth of It's in the early Platonic dialogues. They did believe in it, and we have many very biased translators to thank for coming to understand this stuff so late in the game. You know.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And I love that notion of transcendence that you brought up too. And I thought it was interesting earlier that you made this distinction. I wanted to ask you about you. So you would say that Christianity is above theurgy. Do you not see Christianity as a theurgical process? And if not, can you maybe elaborate on the distinction?
Sure. So the whole thing is that theurgy in the Iamblican sense, it has a different connotation now as it is worked in modern schools of Hermetic magic, really. It was working with the gods in order to basically ask for intercession and ask that they help you to kind of rise up through their spheres so that you can transcend, you can be taken up. I mean, there's even verbiage of this in the letters of St. Paul of being taken up into the third heavenly sphere. You know, there's a lot of that stuff in the New Testament, like astral travel and scrying and stuff like that. I mean, the difference is that with Christ, it's an interior. I mean, according to certain esoteric Christian interpretations, it's an interior thing. I'm not working. I don't want help from those things. I want to circumvent them. I want that which is higher. Okay. And you see that in like the Golden Dawn, right? At a certain point in the inner order, you're tasked with coming into communion with your higher divine genius. Genius is the word that Thomas Taylor used to describe the ancient Greek daimon, which was that guiding sort of tutelary spirit. I don't think that there are one-to-one correlation. Maybe, perhaps, I'm still uncertain whether or not the daimon is that interior aspect or not, but essentially you're circumventing having to utilize. I mean, you still can, but the Christian message is really to walk or to transcend the spheres of causality without needing to work with the cosmokriters or the archons, the planetary deities and things like that. But you know, as it is modernly practiced, I think that there's a syncretism there. There's, you know, because again, we're getting into this in modern esoteric schools, we're kind of reinterpreting the Christian message, how to come into contact with Christ consciousness, what aspect of our personal spiritual architecture does that represent? How do we get in touch with that? Some people call it like the holy guardian angel, right? And it's really interesting. You ask different adepts of the Western esoteric tradition, they say that the higher genius is different than the holy guardian angel. They know for a fact. But I'll put it this way, right? In most rituals, whether they be for spiritual purposes or not, the kairos is very important, okay? That essentially, it's funny, kairos means now in Greek, it basically means weather. But when applied to a ritual, you're basically looking for the planetary weather. You're looking to see what the planets do. And you're looking for the best possible time to perform this operation based on what's going on in these causal spheres. Yet, in the Abramelin operation, which is a major operation in Western esotericism that attempts to put you in touch with your holy guardian angel, they say to ignore the astrological influences because you're trying to get in touch with something that is beyond it. You don't need that if you've got, you know what I'm saying? So it's the difference between training wheels and you know, just
that's a good point.
You know, yeah, it's just the next level of it, and so it's kind of like somebody I know use it in. He said it in a pretty good way, and I don't mean it the same way he means it because he had meant it, I think, in terms of Christian dogmatic orthodoxy. I mean it as in terms of a transcendent spiritual sort of culmination. But I think it holds true to look for anything outside of Christ is to look for what's already here.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good point. This is amazing and fantastic. I'm going to go pee real quick, if you don't mind. I'll be right back. Okay.
Sure. I might go too.
Okay, cool. All right. Ready to roll?
All right. Yeah. So that really the main difference for me is the theurgy not really having the message of the heart the way that Christ taught. And that really is the key. It's like, you know, I think a point of agreement if where modern esotericism meets the sort of the really Christian understanding is in I think it's Flying Roll 10 by it was written by Sam McGregor Mathers, one of the founders of the Golden Dawn. He basically says, like, whether or not you attain this realization, this transcendent meeting with your highest principle will depend directly on your life and your actions in that life. And I think that that's the main difference. Not in terms of this pious moralizing, this whitewashing, this sanitization of Christ, right? But in this sort of cosmic cause and effect, right? Some people call it natural law. It's just, this is the input, this is the feedback. And I mean, that's the first, right? That is masonry. That is masonry. It's the prerequisite to all the Christian mysteries is the idea of cause and effect, basic morality. You know, you could call it Platonic morality, you could call it universal causality, you can call it natural law, but you don't necessarily have that in other. I mean, you've got it in terms of like, if you steal from this guy, I'm going to cut your hand off because we need to, you know, I need to have rules so the society continues. But you have Christ saying it's the laws of behavior. It's what you do in your life that dictates whether or not you transcend. And we find that in masonry, right? We find that in the allegory of the tools. And then eventually, right, you get up to a high enough degree in masonry and certain things happen, and of which I'm not at liberty to discuss, but one of, you know, I guess the quote unquote higher appendant bodies is a Rosicrucian body, right? The SRIA, or SRICF as it is now. And the Outer Order of the Golden Dawn, it's all about that alchemical process, bringing you into balance, bringing you into harmony with everything, rectifying your microcosmic sphere of sensation so that it mirrors more accurately the macrocosm. Then you move into the Rosicrucian mysteries, the mysteries of the cross. It all has that same trajectory, and it's all based on behavior, what you do, what you think, what you say, actions. And it's right directly out of the Bible too. By their fruits shall you know them.
Wow. I love this on so many levels. And one is because I think that maybe from the outside looking in, people that maybe are not familiar with various different esoteric or occult orders, they might have this preconceived sort of judgment about what it all entails. And it's really cool to hear you elaborate on where some of this can go in terms of these philosophical notions and these practical applications in terms of one's life and adopting these principles. And I think that people just often, a lot, that are unfamiliar get these really distorted and confused ideas about what a lot of these things are about. And I mean, even when we talk about Christianity, I may have a preconceived notions as well, but maybe due to my bias or maybe my background. But in terms of Christianity, one that people consistently place their own opinions on, I would say largely, I think that if we think of the word Christianity, we need to look no further than the root of the word Christ and Christianity. And from at least my understanding of the Christ or the Christos in Greek, it's attributed to the one whom is anointed, and the Anointed One as a title. I was wondering if maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that and talk about what that all means.
Sure. First, I want to touch on what you had said, because I've been in the scene of esotericism as through initiatic orders for several years now, and to the point where, like, I'm well acquainted with what's going on. I'm no longer in the dark. I'm no longer in the outer courts. And the issue is that people get into occultism for the wrong reasons. And I mean that almost universally. There's a lot of, there's also that, like, some people have called it like a Gnostic itch. But at the end of the day, it's like, we want to change our lives. There's some selfish, underlying thing that draws us towards this, either as an aesthetic or either as this feeling of lack. I don't have enough, or I don't know enough. And the thing is, I always ask people, I very recently on my Instagram page, I posted, why do you think people gravitate towards the occultism? And I listed 3 pretty awful reasons.
I saw
and
that.
It was, I deliberately did this.
I was like, this is what
I deliberately did this. Right, exactly. And it's because I wanted to see what kind of pushback I got. It was a little experiment. The other part that I don't tell people is that, isn't it fine? Isn't that okay that you get into this stuff for completely human reasons that might not be the best possible thing? That's how we start. I mean, the worst parts of ourselves sometimes bring us to the greatest work. Look at people who have been in recovery for 15 years. If they didn't have that horrific experience, that depth of degradation to the self and to the body and to the mind and the soul, and then recover, there's no way, right? That's a Christian message. That's the message of the prodigal son. It's like, it's better to have sinned first and then repent, because you can help people. You've been in their shoes. You know what I'm saying? And then never to have sinned at all, right? Sin in the New Testament version, I know everybody's well aware of this, means to miss the mark. It's an archery term. It means mistake. It doesn't mean you're going to hell. It means mistake. That's all it is. I'm not afraid of the word sin anymore. It's like, so there's, we come to these things and we, without realizing it, begin what could be the greatest work of our lives. And The issue is some people stay in that sort of like spiritually adolescent phase, that the eternal rebellion, right? And it really, I think, at a certain point, no longer serves you to dwell and be mired in this quote unquote therapeutic blasphemy. It's not really doing anything for you anymore. You're not enlightened, you know. It's like it's like it's more of a put on. It's an aesthetic at this point. It's a lifestyle accessory, and that's not what we want to do in terms of transcendence, right? We want to get out of playing in the mud and trying on different personas all the time. We want to transcend that. But if you stick with these traditions, they all lead the same place. They all lead the same place. In the core traditions of Western initiatic stuff, initiatic lineages, they all lead to the cross. You know, it's just that other people like Crowley, right, did his own thing with it. I'm not familiar with Thelema, because I am not going to get into it. But you know, from what I've read, it's kind of an inversion of all the Hermetic Order, the Golden Dawn stuff that he was, you know, put through. And you have people like Gerald Gardner, who came out of those traditions to found modern Wicca, heavily reliant on Golden Dawn formulas, and completely washed their hands of the inner element, which was, I mean, basically the reason the order existed in the first place. But so with that said, I think that people need that bit of a reality check and kind of historical perspective, right? Like, so many of our issues in not understanding things stem from either an inability or an unwillingness to have some kind of historical context. It just gives you, you know, like the term has said, cultural amnesia. You don't know anything about where you came from. But anyway, what was the question again?
Well, I kind of wanted to get your understanding and your thoughts about the Anointed One and what that all refers to and what that means. Right.
So an important thing to know there, to realize, is that, so Jesus was not the Christ until he was baptized. So he spent however many years, I think 30 or something like that, 29, 30 years. And he shows up to the River Jordan to meet John the Baptist, the forerunner, who said one day, you know, I'm going to have to concede, right? He was the major prophet of his day. You know, there was like this very interesting, what they call the intertestamental period, where there were no prophets in the land of Israel. And so John appears right in the beginning of the Gospels as this forerunner who's saying, like, he's the new prophet, you know, but he's saying, don't focus on me. I'm telling you that he's coming. I'm not him. And so then you have Christ, who ultimately, or Jesus, who comes to St. John the Baptist to be baptized. And it is at that moment that he kneels into the River Jordan and the water's poured over his head, or he's held under, that the dove of the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Spirit as a dove, you know, in the imagery, descends onto him. The skies part and says, "Behold, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." And it's at that point, after the Holy Spirit descends upon him at his baptism in the River Jordan, that he becomes Xristos, anointed, the anointed, and then he begins his ministry. That is when the Christ event really starts. And, you know, all these people are like, well, what about the Tibetan Gospels, and why don't we know anything about his life? It's like, it's all, you know, prologue to the Christ event. And, you know, there was so what does anointment mean? When you're anointed, that word has its root in oil. You're kind of, it was a custom of the Jewish kings, obviously, from which the Christian tradition, you know, came out of, that when there was a new king, they would be anointed with oil. And they also did similar things with the high priests. And so this idea was that Christ was to be a sacrifice, a high priest, and a king. And I think that all, again, reading the text on multiple levels, I think that all that, plays into it. But ultimately, my thoughts on it are that at this point in time, whatever it was that, right, so Christ was, according to Orthodox theology, fully man and fully God. That's disputed or just not agreed with in some of the Gnostic schools of thought. But I think that there is a potential for Christ consciousness in all of us, and I think that Jesus, the man, if we're deciding to talk about it in terms of historicity, Jesus the man was one who was able to completely strip away the self enough so that Christ consciousness could just use him as a vessel in this world. And so when the Christ consciousness spoke through the vessel of the body of Jesus, it had every right to say, I am the Son of God. And I think that really Christ as a blueprint is pushing us to that experience in ourselves. To connect with the highest possible, God, the one, Tohen, the absolute that we were talking about that can't be spoken of, rather than any of these terrestrial kind of gods. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because it's super important, is the idea of the demiurge. Are you familiar with that term?
I've heard that term a number of times. Sometimes I know what it means and sometimes I forget. Yeah, go ahead and elaborate on that. And then I have so much information constantly running through that I know that I've known what that meant at one point, and I forgot it in this moment.
Yeah. So one thing that I wanted to make sure I said is that when we talk about Gnosticism, there's other two forms, I think, of esoteric Christianity, one of them being Christian mysticism. But when we talk about Gnosticism, there tends to be this conflation. People either think Crowley, his sort of Gnostic church, or they think Samael Aun Weor, which for me, no. I am looking, when I study Gnosticism, I'm looking specifically for the early Christian texts, because they came out of a living tradition and communities like that. I mean, everything is ultimately beholden to human error and interpretation. But for me, that's where I kind of intuit the truth. But there's a concept called the demiurge that's been brought to prominence by way of a lot of the more modern kind of Gnostic organizations, and there's a very, very negative connotation sometimes of the demiurge being this kind of like evil creator god, the creative aspect of deity, right? Because if the absolute is so beyond physicality, then how could it create anything without various intermediaries? How could it create anything of this structure? And so we derive how it does that through that sort of emanative theology of Plotinus and even of the Kabbalah. But you have essentially the creator god, and this again goes all the way back to Plato. In the Timaeus, he has Timaeus, the Pythagorean philosopher, kind of describe the creative god as the demiurge, demiurgos, the half worker. And in Plato's conception, or at least through the words of, this is one of the few dialogues where Socrates doesn't speak completely. He has Timaeus, the Pythagorean philosopher, describe the demiurge, and he calls it good, ultimately good, and ultimately it has created everything out of goodness. And it kind of, it could be said that we derive Masonic symbolism from that particular dialogue. It says that he used the compasses to create everything in this very geometric type of creation thing. But So there's the demiurge is very present in Gnostic and esoteric Christianity, but it's very little understood, I think, right now. And I think people should do a little bit more investigation into that concept and come to their own conclusions. But ultimately, in terms of certain sects there are different schools of Gnostic Christianity. I mean, that's the central thing. It's the central thing. Because the demiurge ends up being the God, the creative God that Christ is trying to sort of circumvent, get us to go beyond. Like, this is not the highest. This isn't like you are worshiping this as if it were the highest, but there is something beyond it. And that's where we're trying to get. And that's why the demiurge is a very, very important aspect of esoteric and Gnostic Christianity, because if you're conflating the creative deity with the ultimate or absolute sort of uncreated God, then if you're mixing the two up, then Christianity doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I want to kind of bounce back to when we were talking about baptism. This tradition, it seems, I mean, as John the Baptist was the one that had baptized Jesus, it seems like it definitely was pre-Jesus as well. And this tradition of anointing, and like you said, sort of this like priestly ritual in order to attain that sort of Christ consciousness, was one, apparently it seems like, had been going on for a while. Do you feel like, as far as you're concerned, are there any historical examples of other maybe anointed ones, or maybe it seems like Jesus was the most potent, like fully embodied individual that had adopted this whole Christ consciousness to the fullest in terms of our history as we know it? Maybe that's how we could look at this. What would you say about that?
Well, I would say that the anointing in terms of kings and of priests had more to do with, like, okay, God has chosen you. God has chosen you for this role, not okay, you're going to evolve spiritually. It was much more, God has chosen you for this role. And I think that the appellation of Christos being applied to Jesus has more to do with, again, another symbolic image, another mythic narrative, in order to show that, right, because it's the Holy Spirit that ultimately anoints Christ. It's not the waters of John. John baptized who knows how many other people. None of them became Christ. And it's ultimately the descent of, and it's a really good argument for ritual. Some people say, well, I can, like, there's certain schools of thought that say, like, well, I can just do magic in my head. Well, some of it needs, in a lot of schools of thought, it needs to be grounded by a physical act. There needs to be some sort of physical representation of the spiritual things that are about to happen. And I think that that's kind of a very close parallel, where it's like John is doing this symbolic act, and Christ is putting himself in subservience, right? God can't come down and baptize Christ. So Christ has to submit himself to baptism via John as a physical kind of representation. But it's ultimately the descent of the Holy Spirit into and onto him that is his anointing. It doesn't happen with oil. So it's essentially, it's kind of this term that I don't want to say they use it superficially, but they're definitely saying something that transcends all that stuff and embraces it at the same time, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of Christ, again, is to be both a sacrifice, a high priest, and a king.
Now, do you feel like John had previously maybe received the Holy Spirit, or had maybe been in some form of initiatic process where he had at one time received the Holy Spirit and is kind of passing on this sort of initiatic experience to Jesus? Or what do you think about that?
I mean, it could be. Again, this is kind of where we blur the lines and start talking about, was it history? Was it allegory? What really happened? And I have discomfort committing. Like, I can talk about it, but I don't. I want to be very non-committal in what but not because I'm afraid of offending anybody. I really don't care about any of that. But for me, I don't want to miss the point. I don't want to start talking in one direction.
Good point.
That kind of negates the core of the message. But I mean, it's an interesting thought, right? I definitely think that a portion of the Holy Spirit, so to speak, right, exists with all people who play prophetic roles, in Scripture. I definitely think there's something that inspires them, right? Because who wants to live that life? You only go out into the wilderness and scream and put your life in jeopardy with the authorities if like you don't have a choice. So I mean, I definitely think that the Holy Spirit as this kind of archetype or concept dwells with those sorts of people. And I definitely, there's an interesting thing in Masonry that I know you've touched on with the Holy Saints John, stuff like that. And I want to say that so when we talk about the Holy Saints John, we're talking about John the Baptist, we're talking about John the apostle. Now, it's tradition to attribute the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation to the apostle John. I mean, most scholars will completely refute this. It's kind of baseless, but it's a Christian tradition. And if you're looking at it, the two Johns bookend the New Testament. One's at the beginning, John the Baptist, the forerunner, and one is at the end, John the Divine, who wrote or channeled the book of Revelation from a cave on the island of Patmos. Yes, I know, but really, and then if you look at it, and Masonic brethren will know this, you look at the diagram of the circle with the circumpunct, and then the two lines, the two parallel lines flanking it. This is the symbol meant to convey the Holy Saints John. At either side, kind of bookending the central sun that was the Christ, right? I mean, come on, he had 12 apostles, it's the sun in the zodiac, if nothing else. The thing is, I disagree with the idea of Christ being the exoteric and the Saints John being the esoteric. I think that some people will get that vibe based on preconceived notions of Christianity, particularly the ones that are spoon-fed through the mouthpiece of like canonical dogma, the church, and kind of give you, right? I mean, how much time in church do you spend reading the gospel? You spend a minute and a half, but you get an hour homily of the priest telling you their interpretation, of what it means. When in reality, the truth was so supreme and so transcendent that Christ had to talk in parables that ended up sounding like gobbledygook. It's like, so I mean, it's the most esoteric doctrine of all. But you have there the beginning and the end. And then also, I guess you can again go Neoplatonic, go full Neoplatonic with that diagram. You have the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn on that, circle of the zodiac there, those two Saints John. And in Porphyry's commentary on the Cave of the Nymphs from Homer, he talks about the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn being the two gates through which the soul descends into earth, into materiality, as conceptualized as a cave, and then the gate through which it leaves upon physical death, which is pretty interesting. So stuff there to chew on for the Masonic brethren.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder, have you ever heard of the Disciplina Arcani? I guess it's a Latin for discipline of the secret. I think it was a secret oral tradition only for the baptized. And from what I read, it's a custom that prevailed in the 4th and 5th centuries of Christianity, whereby knowledge of certain doctrines and rites of Christian religion were kept from the non-Christians, and even from those who were undergoing instruction in the faith, so that they may progressively learn the teachings of the faith and not fall to hearsay due to simplistic misunderstandings or something along those lines. Yeah, I was just wondering if you've ever heard anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily in that actual term, that Latin term, those Latin words for it, but I mean, there's an oral tradition in everything, right? I mean, Kabbalah was the oral tradition of the Hebrew, was the Agrapha Dogmata was the oral tradition of the Platonic school. There's just stuff that I guess in modern occultism, they call them self-keeping secrets, right? Like you can't, if you're going to have gnosis, if you're going to have a Gnostic experience, a transcendent experience, how the hell are you going to explain that? If it's transcendent, you can't put it into words. And so that's really what operative Christianity and operative theology is attempting to do. It's trying to, through some sort of discipline, as you're saying, lead you to an experience of some kind that is transcendent. The exoteric versions of that are the sacraments, right? Whereas, the more esoteric versions are stuff like, being assumed and brought up into the starry heaven, or as like St. John the Divine begins the book of Revelation by saying, I was in the spirit when. And then he talks about how all these, angels and archangels come to him and has all these visions and stuff like that. But I think that there could be a component of that to esoteric Christianity. I know it's certainly a part of Hermetic and Rosicrucian magic, but I definitely think there was one, and I think you could. The problem is that most or a lot of gospels, in let's say the Gnostic section, right? There's so much more than the Nag Hammadi. Everybody's go-to is the Nag Hammadi, but there are so many other ones. A really interesting one being in the Bruce Codex, the book of Yehu, which is really it's kind of a Greek transliteration of Eao, which was another divine eon or sort of emanation like that you can find even in the Apocryphon of John. But in the book of Yehu, there are like these, I think it's 4 ceremonial baptisms, and at each baptism is a very, very cryptic book. Very, very cryptic book. But each of these successive baptisms were supposed to bring you further and further through that initiatic trajectory and lead you to that kind of transcendence of the sphere. So you can see glimpses of that in some of the non-canonical writings. Thing is, it can be really difficult to talk about the non-canonical Christian writings because of, first of all, how wide and diverse they are, how fragmentary they are, and just frankly how like abstract they are. They're really difficult to understand. You have to beat your head against them for years.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Something I came across that I didn't quite really understand, but it seemed like there's definitely more to it. So near the time of Origen, someone named Hippolytus of Rome, he wrote at the end of his account of the rite of baptism, quote, if anyone needs to be explained, let the bishop speak in private to those who have received baptism. Those who are not Christians are not told unless they first receive baptism. This is the white stone in which John spoke of. A new name is written on which no one knows except him who receives the stone. is that easy for you to make sense of, or how would you kind of view that statement? For me, it's a little confusing.
Oh, it's just as confusing for me. What's really interesting there actually is there, again, I'm seeing another parallel to Masonry. Uh, but so right, I wasn't, I was born, or I was raised Catholic. I kind of, walked away from that for a long while, and kind of toiled in the forests of occultism and comparative religions and stuff like that, and to great effect, but it eventually led me right back to Christianity. Just now kind of understanding things from a different perspective. But one of the things that stayed with me is that through all my initiatic trajectories, right, it's something happens to you after that first initiation. And you are, however subtle, not the same person. You're just not. And you never will be again. Even if down the line you start to violently rebel against that, your ego, right, your personas, they start rebelling against the change because they know that a death is happening for them. You can never go back. You can never go back. Initiation, if done correctly, is to me, I mean, there are very few experiences that are more important and more significant. And baptism is a rite of initiation. It's a rite. It's a sacrament. It's still used in many different forms of Christianity, and it's arguably the most important, which is why it's given to you very early. And what does it represent, right? Why do you have to undergo the waters? Why do you have to? We're constantly simulating things that happened to Christ, and I mean, obviously, the most obvious sort of correlation is purity, is being purified and being washed and made new. And this idea of a white stone, just kind of really, to me, smacks of or it says volumes about this idea of purity, and that kind of connotation. And what is written
purity
on the stone, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a huge thing, right? What are philosophers, or what are alchemists looking for, right? The philosopher's stone. What are Masons constantly trying to become? Well, they're trying to become that polished cornerstone. They're trying to hew away at the rough ashlar, and come to a state of perfection. And I think that represents a new day, right? Like, you have dwelt in darkness, and here, this was your ceremony to overcome and to come into the light. And that's definitely one of the purposes that baptism serve. It's the penultimate rite of Christianity, right? So I think that has a lot to do with it. What I'm finding as an interesting correlation is that, you get something that's written on the stone and given only to you, and only you understand it. And I think that, and in some spiritual traditions, you're asked to, come up with a motto, that you'll use as your name throughout the order. You'll sign your papers that way and all that stuff. Usually in some kind of, scriptural alphabet. And sometimes these things just kind of deliver themselves to you, and all the thinking and the head scratching you did was all for naught. And this message that you needed to hear, right? Because in some systems, it's like your motto is supposed to say something about what you're hoping to accomplish, and sometimes it comes to you rather than you finding the perfect one. And to me, I'm not saying that that's what that, the words on the stone that only you know the meaning to, I'm not saying that's exactly what it is, but upon hearing about it, there's definitely something similar to sounding to that, and the experience that I've had.
Yeah. Okay. So, sort of in regards to something you said earlier on when you were saying, in regards to like Sol Invictus, in regards to Mithraism. So to me, it seems like there's also a close relationship between Gnosticism and Esoteric Christianity. There's a French scholar and a philologist named Isaac Casaubon, who I guess he first proposed something called, the discipline of the secret. And he held a view that the church fathers were basically imitating the Roman mystery religions. And so, kind of in regards to that comment that you made earlier in regards to Mithraism, I wonder what you think about that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I think, again, kind of like what I was saying earlier, I think that so look at our time, right? Look at the time period we live in. I think the word that you used earlier was zeitgeist, right? And that, I think, it means like spirit of the times.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that Mithraism we don't know anything about Mithraism other than he slayed the bull and stuff like that. It's very, very scant. We know that it was available to there was the Mithraeum that was usually underground. It was typically populated by Roman, soldiers. But we don't really have much there. Even in like something like the PGM in the Mithras liturgy, I mean, it's kind of an oblique reference to Mithra. He's not a central figure. We don't know anything about that rite any better. But I think suffice it to say that something was occurring in the spirit of the times, because they were very, very close together. And a lot of people will read that and be, they'll be like, oh, it's a no-brainer. It's just a one-to-one correlation. But I tend not to, after all these years, I tend to stop looking at everything from, I guess, to borrow a Kabbalistic analogy, from Malkuth up. I tend now to view things from like spirit downwards. I have re-enchanted my world fully. And to me, there is something much larger evidently at work than just dead, blind coincidence and whoever wins out at the end through the vilest means. And I think that, Christianity and the Christian myth, right? Look at where we are. Look at where we are. So many, thousands of years have passed. And we're still talking about Christ. It's still here. It's
Yes.
not going anywhere. There is no part of the world that Christianity has not touched.
Yes.
And I think that says something. And I think that Mithraism and all that other stuff, because there was a lot of other stuff going on, it's all very, very, very similar. I think it was an intimation of the spirit, the underlying spirit of the times, moving towards this final dispensation, this ultimate revelation of the highest spiritual expression of human beings, no longer subject and having to give worship and tribute to these kind of desert or sky gods, and now finding a way to transcend their fate. And really it comes through the life and blueprint of the Christ. And that was Christ's message, was that it's not, yes, believe in me, but it's not enough to believe in me. You have to do what I've done.
Yeah, I mean, dang, I'm with you 100% on that. I definitely am with you on that spirit downward approach as well. And that guy Isaac Casaubon, I think was his last name. He's definitely interesting. I think he also
Casaubon, yeah.
Yeah, you're familiar. Yeah, he's an interesting guy too. I think he had an analysis of the Corpus Hermeticum as well, where he kind of, I guess, overturned the previous general opinion that the texts dated to almost the time of Moses, and he relocated them between 200 and 300 AD, I guess. He placed them the 4th century AD rather than the much earlier Hermetic period, which they had generally been ascribed. I definitely want to learn more about how he arrived at that conclusion, and I guess he had also impacted some of the.
Well, one thing that I do want to say is that I've met. This is going to rub some people the wrong way, but so mote it be. I went to college. I dropped out several times. Went back, dropped out. I am not unfamiliar with. It's not like I did bad. I did good. I had a high GPA. At a certain point, I was very, very, very much involved in the newspaper at my school and all sorts of extracurriculars. It's not like I hated it, but I did get a good cross section of, I guess, training your mind in that way, right? The mind is, the brain is trained, and what I have found, and it's particularly true in like, those classical sort of scholars around the time of the quote unquote Enlightenment, a lot of the justification is like behind that kind of very, very sterile and skeptical research is to avoid bias. But in my experience, I've never seen such a potent display of justifying bias as in scholarly interpretations of things. It's just a dead materialist skeptical bias. So for me, it's, I tend to take both hand in hand. Right. I'm somebody, I guess, who has learned to be able to, because I use scholarly material all the time. It's just that I don't put all of my eggs in that basket. I can't keep constantly outsourcing my locus of subjective experience and validation. It has to be tempered. I have to remain in the middle. And so what you need to be able to do, I think, is take that kind of information as well as what you're experiencing, particularly if you're engaged in spiritual pursuit, and you have to be able to hold them in front of you side by side at all times, without having to reconcile it. And a lot, like I've mentioned before in some of the content I put out, a lot of people call that the pinnacle of cognitive dissonance, but that again only comes because we've trained our minds to need to have one single answer. So Casaubon, not really the guy for me.
So basically, Isaac Casaubon doesn't know what the F he's talking about, is what you're saying. Just kidding.
I mean, he may not, but
well, interestingly, apparently he had also had some impact on the King James translation, and he corresponded with the translators of the King James version of the Bible and helped resolve some translation issues too, I guess. So kind of interesting. Yeah, and in regards to, sorry, go ahead.
You know what I'd recommend. I don't know if I've said this on your show before, but for people that are trying to like make sense of the canonical gospels, I would recommend I have the Parallel Bible, which takes the King James version and puts it side by side with the Amplified Bible. Which is kind of like a more literal, and they offer multiple ways that one or two sentences or passages could be interpreted. Because like language, especially like, Romance language, like Greek and back, in antiquity, I mean, they had like 9 or 10 different words for the slightly different, there's the Greek eros, there's the Greek agape, there's all these different words. We were talking about time earlier, chronos, kairos, aura. There's so many words that have such subtle nuance of meaning. So I would recommend that people get that if they're really serious about trying to parse some of the Christian esoteric interpretations.
Yeah, I agree with you. Man, I think Greek is so invaluable in terms of being able to understand a lot of these things too, obviously, because most of the New Testament in particular has derived from the Greek. but yeah, so in kind of in regard to the Bible, I'm curious of your thoughts on, because there's so many areas of the Bible where it refers to and says the Lord or the Lords, things along these lines. Do you personally, do you correspond anytime you see when it says the Lord in the Bible, do you correspond that with the same entity or being as Yahweh or God, or are these different aspects, or how do you view this?
So again, going with that analogy, right? That's all it is. It's just an analogy, a way to help the mind conceptualize something that transcends words. I would go again with the analogy of the beam of white light passing through the prism and splintering into the rays of the colors of the rainbow. And I would take this analogy and I would actually correspond that to, I guess, in the Hermetic Kabbalah, they're called divine names. So they each represent, right? Because they are different names, right? There's Shaddai El Chai, there's Adonai Haaretz, and all these different things. That's Adonai is Lord, is the Lord. Shaddai is mighty God. So they're different aspects of the manifest qualities or potencies of the Godhead, but they're, for me, right, on a personal level, the way that I understand it is that they're pretty far removed from the absolute in terms of, I would say, like, they are different, maybe, aspects of a similar being. For me, I equate like Yod He Vav He, Yahweh, the tetragrammaton. In my mind, that represents the demiurge, the creative, sort of creative deity that has regency over everything, and is, I guess, has emanated so far away from source, right, that it begins to believe I'm doing this myself. And so therefore, right, in the Apocryphon of John, another esoteric, Gnostic text, he talks about, he names this demiurge Ialdabaoth, which is significant because the prefix is Iao, which is the Greek equivalent of Yod He Vav He, tetragrammaton. And he calls it Ialdabaoth, and he says that he acknowledged none before him other than his mother, Sophia. And I think that that's really, really telling and significant in that, okay, in the emanative hierarchy, right, we're taking Plotinus's idea of the absolute unmanifest, sort of emanating beings and creative principles and entities out from itself. It gets to a point where the thing being emanated doesn't realize that I stem from something too. It just thinks that I'm the creator God. I'm doing all of this. I can create. I can make my own little world. And I don't mean to put a negative connotation on that, but that's kind of what I believe, Yahweh to represent. Whereas I don't have the same view when you talk about like Yod, tetragrammaton Elohim. I think it's Eloah being a feminine name with im being a masculine plural, to me suggests like the gods and goddesses, the cosmocrators of the Neoplatonic school, the archons. And I'm not saying that that's a one-to-one, but that's kind of how I've parsed the material, since you're asking, my opinion. But that's subject to change,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because I always found it interesting just because, I mean, if you look back in history or if you look at different texts or stories outside of the biblical scripture, you hear or you see the word Lord pop up very often, very commonly, just, maybe it's like the landlord or something. And, so I'm wondering, like, maybe some books of the Bible where, particular authors say things along the lines of, and the Lord said, da, la, 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 or, the Lord came to me and da, 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 da. Like, I'm wondering, like, is that always in reference to, like, maybe these are different beings or entities? I don't know. And I'm not drawing any conclusions. I'm just curious about your thoughts. And I wonder if that's like a theologically what scholars have kind of concluded about these things. You know what I mean?
Well, there's a big difference between theological scholars and secular scholars. And I don't think they'd agree with anything that I've said this evening on either camp. But in my opinion, yeah, I mean, there's so much room for interpretation. If you're not parsing things out in, like, using Strong's lexicon or something like that, Strong's concordance, and going through the Greek and figuring out what the words actually mean, when you find something that just doesn't stick, it's not sounding right, this is vague, this is too obscure, go take a look at the context. That's our best clue. Do I think they were talking about potentially a landlord? I mean, maybe a cosmic one, but probably not like, a physical landlord coming to them and saying that they, I don't know, have to now never eat pork again or something like that. But I do think that it's a good point to bring up, particularly because there is another Bible, right, called the Names of God Bible. So instead of listing everything as the Lord or God, it takes the actual Hebrew name where it is listed, and it inserts it. But the thing is, again, all this is to say that, these divine names, these God names, were prevalent in the Old Testament, whereas in the New Testament, it's not so. I mean, God is referred to as, my heavenly Father, your heavenly Father, right? I mean, it's Jesus in the canonical Gospels called himself the Son of God, but he also gave that appellation to all of us when he taught us in that gospel how to pray. Our Father who is in heaven, not Christ's Father, our Father who is in heaven. So that was more the verbiage of the Christian dispensation, whereas in the Old Testament, the former dispensation, the incomplete law, according to Christ, they were dealing with all these different deities and stuff. There's some crazy stuff, if you read the book of Enoch and stuff like that. That's some wild stuff in the Old Testament. It definitely sounds like this is what it sounds like to me. It sounds like they're saying, okay, we left Ur, we left Sumeria, and they have their pantheon of gods. We're now going to do this other thing because you said that you were going to be our God if we didn't worship any other gods but you. And you would give us like a place and a home, and you'd give us children and all that stuff. So that's a pretty good deal. Why don't we just do that? And it sounds like a contractual thing, like a pact. And that's what they called it. They called it a covenant. This is the covenant. This is the agreement. This is the contract we have. And to me, that Christianity or Christ came to sort of say, no, you don't, it's not about signing contracts. It has nothing to do with that, right? I mean, the thing that Yod-He Vav-He, Yahweh, whatever you want to call it, the demiurge, I mean, it was constantly saying, I'm going to give you this, I'm going to give you that, I'm going to give you riches, I'm going to give you land. Whereas Christ comes and he says, it will be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He also says, You cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon. And very conveniently in the King James Version, right? I mean, commissioned by a regent, a monarch, he didn't want the word mammon translated to what it really meant, which is money. You cannot serve God and money. You know, so I mean, Christ was coming to tell you to walk away from this stuff. This is how you get out. You have to leave the game. You don't play. There's not a good option. And that's the important, the message. That is the Gnostic message. It's just kind of like, look, everything about this realm is a little wonky. Is it beautiful? Yes, absolutely. But it's because the demiurge uses these, he's basing, that entity is basing its creation on forms that are perfect, but it cannot create perfect forms. That's why everything here shifts. That's why everything here changes. That's why things here die. They decay and they die. Okay, because it cannot create perfectly, but it is basing its creations on perfect forms, which it understands. This is a very, very deep Gnostic, esoteric Christian doctrine that it has its roots in Platonism. And essentially it says, okay, so we're kind of trapped here. We've got these beautiful forests, but guess what? I mean, like, animals eat each other. Like, there's also a really dark, decaying, people suffer. Wars happen. People get sick. They die. They suffer. This is a very imperfect realm. You cannot not, you have to acknowledge that. It's not all love and light all the time. It's not a Pixar movie. If you invite a bear to a birthday party, it'll probably kill you. It's like it's there's like there are harsh realities to this. And so, that is part of the imperfection of this unresolved duality, this push-pull of light and dark. And that is never going anywhere. That is never going anywhere. That is to take one of the pillars of the temple and pull them away. Well, now everything falls. Creation cannot exist without polarity. Period. End of story. Is it, does that kind of suck? Yes. But that's why Christ's message was to treat people with love. Have love in your heart and abandon the ways of the world. That's the best you can do. It's spiritual ascent. That's
100%. Yeah. And it also, I mean, all of that polarity and difference, it creates the possibility for the various forms of life and variation that we experience, and makes possible all of the different paths that can occur. And that's what kind of makes life beautiful as well. So it's ironic in that sense, but you made a lot of good points. I think like you were saying about, like, it's not about contracts 100%. Like, Jesus heavily spoke out against the Pharisees in that regard with their lawful sort of impositions that they tried to impose. And I guess I have like a couple more questions to piggyback off of the things that you said so far. I'm curious, and like with Yahweh, or like the Old Testament Yahweh, and then the New Testament Yeshua or Jesus, do you view them as the same entity, or do you view them as different, or do you fall along the lines of that Trinitarian model, that Yahweh of that Old Testament was the New Testament Jesus incarnate in some form? Or how do you make sense of all that? And then I'll ask you my next question after that.
Sure. So this is how I've come to understand it. Yahweh, the ineffable name, the Tetragrammaton, tends to also be reflective of a formula, being a letter, being a word of 4 letters. We have essentially the terrestrial elements, is a way that you can look at it from, and I'm coming at this from sort of a place of Hermetic Kabbalistic exegesis, interpretation through the various, Western esoteric lineages. So you essentially have Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the Tetragrammaton, which represents the terrestrial elements, fire, water, air, and earth. And that is kind of its creative milieu, right? It is the demiurge. It makes the universe, the visible universe. The the descent of the shin, the insertion of the shin as the balance point in between the yod-he and the vav-he of Yahweh, right? The tetragrammaton become the pentagrammaton, means that spirit from beyond has descended into the material. So again, it comes not to break, but to complete the law, right? And that when you go from a 4 to a 5, you know, you now have something very, very different for anybody who's familiar with things like sacred geometry and all that implies. But rather to then digress into that again, you know, I do not view them as the same. I view Christ as the salvific power that comes to lead a way to the beyond. It is it essentially parts, you know, the terrestrial elements, parts the demiurge, so that we now have a clear path through and past it, right? Shin being spiritual fire. I don't view the God Yahweh of the Old Testament as the same God that Christ of the New Testament, and the apocryphon, the apocryphon and the Gnostic text. I don't think they were talking about the same. The same is not evident to me at this stage, right? I've not read all of them, but it's not evident to me that they were speaking of the same being. I tend to think that Christ came to talk about the beyond, the absolute, and that which is higher. Even when you look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, if you look at the divine names on the Kabbalistic tree of life, Yod-He Vav-He tetragrammaton is not the highest. You know, that is not the divine name for Keter, you know, or for the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof, just, you know, really not having a divine name other than that. But Eheye is the divine name for Keter. I am, right? And that's again one of the names given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Eheye Ashur Aheye. I am that I am. But that's kind of the way I view it in terms of I would say, Western esoteric, hermetic, Kabbalistic, occult interpretation of the Gnostic equation of Yeshua and the Tetragrammaton.
Definitely resonates with me a lot more. Okay, and so earlier you brought up Sumerian, and I am familiar with the various Sumerian tablets. There's millions at this point, most of which are stored in I think the British Library. And I think like 90% of them haven't even yet been translated or something. I think only like 10% have been. But we've got various Sumerian tablet translations that basically a lot of them mimic or describe a lot of the same events that are recorded in the Old Testament biblical scriptures. And so I was thinking of, like, you know, the Anuna or the Anunnaki in regards to the Sumerian tablets. I wonder if this has been any consideration for you and how you think of all these things. And I don't know if that informs your opinions overall, or if you've considered that, if it changes anything, or just what are your what's your take on the Sumerian tablets and the whole Anunnaki thing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm somebody who has pretty much considered everything, if possible. I mean, everything that my mind can become aware of, I'll consider. So, right, Abraham being the biblical patriarch of both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? They all claim descent from Abraham. Abraham left, I think it was like Ur HaKazdim, something like that, the city of Ur of the Chaldeans, you know, which those were the ancient peoples of modern day Iran, Akkadian, Sumerian, Assyro-Babylonian. They all kind of stemming from that tradition. There was a lot of cross-pollination between the Hebraic people and the Syrian, I guess, or Chaldean, Sumerian, but he came out of Ur. That was like the first of the commandments of El. El was the god. El is a god from the Chaldean pantheon, called Abraham, his wife Sarai, and his nephew Lot and his wife, and said, leave the city of Ur and, wander, go into the desert, and I will form this agreement, and we'll make a pact. And you have things like Noah's flood, or the Great Flood and Noah's Ark, and you have things like the Sumerian tale of Utnapishtim and all that stuff.
Epic of Gilgamesh.
Right, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Utnapishtim being the sort of the Noah character in all that. And it's fascinating stuff, and I do believe it all shares a history. Do I think we'll ever know it? No, I don't think that. I think that things have gone so far out of hand in the way of systems of control of information, and the sort of curating the academic availability of these texts. And then also, on the other hand, it's like the whole Anunnaki thing. Of course, if you read the book of Enoch, and he talks about the Nephilim, what is Nephilim means? Nephel means to fall. He's not saying about anything. He's not saying anything else other than like some things that fell out of the sky and came down here.
Interesting.
But I'm at that point. Oh, absolutely. I think about this stuff all the time. For me, it's much more of this idea of like archonic forces, like in Gnosticism. You have these overlords that serve one purpose, and that one purpose is their own continued existence. And that, to me, is what the archons, or the archontes, or cosmocratos of the Neoplatonic and early Gnostic ideologies, that to me is what they symbolize. And I am at this point, at this juncture, viewing it in line with that. If I were to read things more literally, it changes things. But again, I am a person who can hold two things in front of me without needing to resolve them for as long as that needs to happen. And I may never resolve them, and I'm fine with that. It doesn't bother me. That's you can't know it all. You can't know it all. And I tend to think that like this chase of historicity is a product of postmodernism. It's a product of like, no, I need everything to have some sort of material one-to-one. They couldn't have been talking symbolically. They can't be talking about the soul, because I can't experience the soul. I can't experience spiritual energies, so it has to be something physical. And so aliens, which that's fine, because it very well, I'm not saying there's no chance, right? But I tend not to read things that way, because the way that I have read things in a more symbolic way has been more spiritually useful to me. I've been able to transform my life in ways that I don't think I could have. I think I would have just gone down a paranoid rabbit hole if I was just constantly, it had to be the physical thing. It had to be the Anunnaki.
For sure. Okay, I'm curious. What are your interpretations of the word Elohim? Because I'm sure you're aware of this debate between what people interpret that word as being multiple, a plurality versus a singular in terms of the Elohim. Some people ascribe and attribute the Elohim within regards to the Sumerian tablets as being in regards to the Anuna or the Anunnaki, as being multiple beings that sort of set up this thing at the beginning, whatever, in regards to these early stories. Not to say or not to discount that there is one God above and above all of that, but just in regards to these stories, there's also the interpretation of it being sort of a feminine and a masculine, not necessarily vibing one particular quality. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this term Elohim?
So I think I mentioned it earlier before. When I see Tetragrammaton Elohim married together as kind of a divine name. So right, Elohim comes from Eloah, right? Aleph Lamed Hey, I'm pretty sure. Eloah or Aleph Lamed Vav Hey. I can't remember exactly how it's spelled in Hebrew at this point, but that is a feminine counterpart or name for El, right? That first god that we were talking about. So the suffix, there are generally two pluralities in terms of they're expressed in two suffixes in Hebrew, I am or yod mem and ot, which is I believe vow tau or so yod mem im is a masculine plural and Eloah is a feminine name. There's no other way to interpret that. I mean, there are things missing, right? Like there's some nuance and context that we will never have because we will never get to talk to people who are alive at this point and people who are actively writing or it's just not going to happen. But there is no other way to interpret that. It's a feminine name with a masculine plural. So at the very when you see Elohim translated as God and not gods, that does not make an iota of sense to me. To me, that is a drastic. Again, it's shoehorning what you want to be the truth, or just your misunderstanding. You're shoehorning that into a very convenient bracket term, and you're doing an injustice. Inherit it, right? Because you and I are not going to go and translate things from Hebrew to Greek to, it's not going to happen. So we're at the mercy of right. Well, I mean, I'm already doing that, but I didn't want to come across as pompous, but it's just you are for years. I was for years until I was about 32 at the mercy of whatever shitty translation was available, and I tend to, like I said, view maybe again, not a complete one-to-one. I don't want to shoehorn anything, but in my experience and my meditations and my understanding as it unfolds and progresses and evolves as inevitably it should, the Tetragrammaton represents what the Gnostics considered the demiurge, and we find it a very suitable kind of way in which the Elohim and the Tetragrammaton are blended together as a divine name that we do see the demiurge working with the cosmocrators or the archontes. And what's interesting about that is that in certain Gnostic, and I think it's more Gnostic, but certainly coming out of Neoplatonic cosmology and cosmogony, each of the archons had what was called a syzygy. So they were separated into pairs of male and female, and they were each other's complement. And so Elohim as a feminine name and a masculine plural and a plurality there suggests to me these archonic syzygies.
Wow. Okay. So then I guess in regard to like Genesis, because in Genesis, it does, I think, if I recall correctly, it does refer to the Elohim. So how would you describe for people what's being conveyed there?
Well, it depends on the context, right? The passage and stuff like that. But ultimately, if you're talking about Elohim, let's say, for instance, Yod He Vav He, Elohim planted a garden eastward in Eden. Okay, you take maybe that kind of, and the Elohim said, "Let us make them in our image."
Yes, exactly.
So that to me is, it's a perfect one-to-one correspondence of this idea of the archonic influences symbolized by, planetary deities, or whatever, I guess the Platonic or Neoplatonic word for it is logistikon, whatever order exists in order to sort of permutate, congeal, and bind the influences that go into constructing and maintaining the physical universe. Those essences are going to be imparted into man and woman, right? Let us make them male and female, right? Let us make them male and female in our image. The Elohim, male and female. So it's because there are two separate. A lot of people don't realize this. There's not one story of the Garden of Eden, even in the canonical Bible. There are two. There's one where like Adam had a previous wife, right, Lilith, but in that particular one, it's definitely, to me, just showing the way this hierarchy of the creative deity and its emissaries, which have sort of manifested and as essences, as underlying permutations or essences of all of material creation, are now saying, let's make people, let's make them like us. I think it was definitely saying something about there being a plurality involved, and I definitely think a duality, right? Because that's the central theme there, making man and woman and taking, Eve from Adam. You're taking a unity and you're dividing it. And that's essentially what the first act of emanation was the absolute creating something outside of itself. And then that just kind of perpetuating to the nth degree, almost in a fractal kind of way. And I think that when you hear those things or read those things in the Old Testament, in Genesis and stuff like that, I think that that's kind of what it's talking about. It's certainly not God said, let me make man in my image. It's definitely, and the gods, male and female, said, let us make them in our image, male and female.
Yeah. All right. Well, dang, we've definitely covered a lot of ground. Are there any particular points that maybe we didn't touch on, or anything that you feel is super important in regards to the subject of esoteric Christianity? Anything at all that you would like to kind of go over?
Yeah, one thing. I want to break from the kind of like intellectual discourse and pulling all this information out of thin air and just say, like, the Christian message is one of love, and it's transcendence via love. It's love despite everything else. And I don't think that you come into closer communion with Christianity by learning about it. I think that you come closer to being a true Christian by being in the heart and living that way in the world, which can be difficult, right? I mean, because Christ, as the Sacred Heart, he wasn't nice all the time. He smacked people out. He scourged, he whipped the money changers in the temple and said, this is my Father's house. You've turned it into a den of thieves. He knocked over all their shit and whipped them. He kicked them in the ass out of the temple. And sometimes that's love, but unequivocally to do the right thing for the right reasons, no matter what. I think that, that is the way. That is the way of transcendence. And despite all the books and who said what and all these people's interpretations, if you live from the heart, you can't go wrong. I think that can get translated a lot of different ways. I think that means be soft all the time? Heavens no. You need a good combination. But you need a good combination. But I think that the whole reason for me just saying this is because we can get lost in intellectual discourse that is essentially just chasing our tails. And without this key piece, I don't think a discussion on Christianity of any kind is worth having. So I definitely wanted to throw that in there, and I wanted to, just say, like, you had posted some stuff today about not being married to your opinions and keeping an open mind, and I think that people need to, especially within the occult and especially within secular kind of communities that are more prone to secular research and academic studies, cut Christianity a break. It's not the only thing in the world that threatens rights and threatens lives. We vaporized men, women, and children in 2 cities with an atomic bomb. Okay, science can do it too, right? Because it's ultimately, it's ultimately human extremism, not the thing itself. So, come at it from that approach. Everybody's different. They're at a different stage of their development. You're always meeting somebody that's in process. Bear with them. If they can't be the Christian that they aspire to be, then, maybe you could hold that space for them and do it for them or with them. So it doesn't have to be this ongoing, basically just temper tantrum. I mean, and people are so incredibly and misinformed. It's like there's no productive discussion to have. So if those could be the 2 last things that I leave off with, then I'm very happy that we were able to have a conversation. I love being on your show and having talks with you all the time because of how warm you can be and how open your mind is.
Absolutely. The feeling is mutual, and dang, yeah, I definitely agree. Like the way of the heart, I'm on board with that 100%. Compassion, forgiveness, all of that. And especially in the times that we're in right now, and there's really not a lot of people I'm aware of out there currently that I can have a conversation like this with. I just want to say I'm definitely grateful and very appreciative of your ability to articulate and your depth of knowledge and research and inquiry into all of these various things that we've covered this evening. So gratitude and appreciation. You're the man. Where can people find you and learn more about what you're up to? Maybe your channel, any place that you'd like to direct people to?
Well, I'm pretty sure I'll be banned from social media after this airs. No, I'm kidding. I have a podcast myself and a YouTube channel. It's called Arcanvm, but for some reason I decided to. I didn't have the foresight to think that I'd have to explain it on a podcast. So it's spelled ARCANVM. So that's Arcanvm. It's the Arcanvm YouTube channel and podcast. It's on YouTube. The podcast is on Spotify. Got some books and stuff coming out, some articles, and you can find all my information typically there or Facebook. I'll post about it or I'll link to it. So lots of cool stuff. Classes happening too. So
greatly appreciate you.
Thank you.
And
likewise.
And yeah, till next time, brother. Appreciate you.
All right. Have a good night. Thanks so much, Sky.
You too.